The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, Predict Traders, and thank you for joining our webinar on Brexit today. My name is Andreas Katsouris, and I'll be talking for the next half hour or so with Michelle Egan, who's a fellow with the Wilson Center's Global Europe program. We're open to your questions for the next half hour, so if you have any questions for Dr. Egan, please do send them to us. The email address is events@predict.org, events@predict.org. In addition to being a fellow at the Wilson Center, Dr. Michelle Egan is a professor in the School of International Service at American University. She's the author of a recently published book, Single Markets, Economic Integration in Europe and the United States. She's the past chair of the European Studies Association, and that's the largest professional association focusing on European integration. And she's a member of Transworld, a multi-institution project on transatlantic relations and global governance. Dr. Egan's work focuses on comparative regionalism, trade politics, and global governance. Dr. Egan, welcome to Predict It.
Thank you very much for having me.
It's very nice to have you. So big vote in the UK tomorrow. David Cameron makes a kind of reluctant critic of the EU, it seems, planned this vote as a way of dealing, some say, with dissent in his own Conservative Party, and a way of putting the European question to rest before the last election. Is that a fair assessment of his motives? And if it is, how's he doing?
Well, I think you're absolutely spot on. 2013, he made an electoral promise in his manifesto. If you elect me or re-elect me, I will give you a referendum on Europe. Part of this was because of the concern and surge of the UKIP party, which, attracted about 4 million votes at the last election, but only got one seat. So part of it was to deal with the sort of friction on the right and the sort of effort to try and get Britain out of Europe. And quite frankly, a lot of people did not see it coming in terms of the polls that he would win an outright victory. So he's fulfilling an electoral pledge. He's basically doing that because he has an internally fractured political party. He's got about 178 MPs on his side who will vote Remain. He's got about 130 of his own party that want to exit. So it's absolutely, this is something that some people call it a self-inflicted wound because he's brought all this turbulence by trying to deal with the party management issue.
And is it reasonable to assume he didn't expect to find himself the day before the vote in such a cliffhanger? Was the
well, a cliffhanger it is, but this is his second cliffhanger. I mean, remember, he's given us a cliffhanger in the Scottish referendum as well, not so long ago. So that poll tightened up very, very closely. And it was only at the end when he promised a whole set of devolution and really brought out the risk factor of leaving and, the prospect that Scotland wouldn't be able to use the pound. It was only then that people sort of voted very much in terms of, staying with Britain. So this is his second time round, and one could argue that he had the momentum initially in February, but it tightened up very, very quickly in June.
And what are the arguments that Remain side? Maybe you could review for our listeners the arguments of both sides in brief. Why stay in the European Union and why go, according to the respective campaigns?
Yes, there are two official campaigns. The Vote Leave campaign is very much not as much associated with UKIP. It's Boris Johnson and Michael Gove, who's obviously a cabinet minister. And a lot of their concern is sort of the Eurosceptic wing of the party And it's really about, they use the issue of sovereignty sometimes. You know, we would like more control in terms of legislative powers. We would like more control of our borders. We would also like to deal with sort of restrict immigration and free movement of labor. And we would very much like to deal with those issues. Now, in terms of some of the issues, though, are not necessarily, some of those issues are not necessarily EU related. A lot of the criticisms has been this is swamping our National Health Service, our public services, and so forth. And quite frankly, these have been cut for a long time due to austerity measures. So this is not the EU cutting them, this is domestic political party choices. Now on the other side, in terms of the Remain side, it's all about the economy. It's all about market access. It's all about sort of having access to the largest single market in the world and being able to sort of work in terms of work throughout Europe. The British is really a service economy. It's the center, the financial center, and it's all about being part of an integrated economy and using that leverage for other trade agreements.
You characterize the leave argument as if I understood correctly, as a vote against the government, or as an opportunity, as many referenda are, to criticize the government in general. But the Leave campaign is also run by conservatives, largely by conservatives. So if it seems a little hard to understand how a largely conservative base could be casting a protest vote against its own government. Is there something I'm missing there? Who are the Leave supporters if they're not conservatives?
The Leave supporters, this is, both campaigns are run by the political establishment, and Cameron's got a divided cabinet. He's got 26 members of his cabinet who want to remain. He's got 6 people who want to leave. So he's got an internally divided cabinet. The campaigns are being run by sort of very much the political establishment. There were a bunch of campaigns out there, Business for Europe, Vote Leave, Brexit. There's been a variety of them, that have emerged, the European movement to stay in the EU, but there are 2 official campaigns. Yes, the majority of this is being run by the political establishment, the leaders, both mostly in the Conservative. The Labour Party has been supportive of remaining. The Labour Party leadership, Jeremy Corbyn, has been sort of a lukewarm supporter, but his own party, except for 10 members, is uniformly in support of remaining in the EU. And most of the trade unions this time want to remain in the EU, which is different than 1975. And so there are only a couple of more left-wing unions, GMB and Unite, that want out. And so this is really, so who's supporting this? This is, but the rhetoric is nationalist. The rhetoric is populist, it's nationalist, and it's picking up some steam. And the people who are supporting it come from a cross-section in the UK. Some of them are traditional conservative supporters, conservative political party. Some of them might be more Labour supporters. And they come from different parts of the UK. It can be people sort of in northern England, in Cumbria up north. It can be people in the southeast corner, in Somerset and Devon. But it's mostly older. It's mostly a generational issue. So it's mostly people over 55. Most of the people who are 18 to 25, if they're college educated or they've traveled, they tend to be much more supportive. So it's really, tapping into, I think, people who've been severely affected by the economic recession, and they sort of are looking for blame.
Is there an analogy that could be made here between the breakdown of support for Brexit and the U.S. presidential campaign? I'm thinking of support for Donald Trump in particular has been described as cutting across traditional ideological lines in a similar way and being more an economic appeal rather than a traditional left-right one. Do you think that's fair?
I think it's difficult to, we don't have any exit polls, so we're not going to know who ends up voting how they will on June 23rd. But there's something to be said about, you know, some people who feel they've been left behind, or there's been growing income inequality in Britain. You know, house prices make it very difficult to buy in places like London and the surrounding area. So these people are sort of saying, you know, I've seen a lot of cuts in my public services, cuts in my social welfare. You know, things are very expensive. It's hard to get a foothold in the housing market. You know, so yes, to some degree, is it tapping into certain sentiments of populism and nationalism? Absolutely. But it's, you know, and of course, you know, we talk about this, but then we could argue and say, well, there are certain parts of Britain that are supportive. You know, Scotland and Wales certainly supports remaining in the EU, according to our polls and according to what we know. So it's hard to sort of predict, you know, why certain regions are supporting or not supporting. So the bigger issue is obviously the people who are closely tied to London, who are, you know, who are much more, to some degree, better off, are much more likely to want to remain. So it really is a, you know, it has really sort of divided Britain across many sort of socioeconomic, territorial lines. And so you see some of the same elements as we're seeing here in the U.S.
Okay, well let's turn the conversation into what to expect over the next 24 or 48 hours. And maybe you can resolve what seems like an anomaly to me. I'm looking at the latest polling over the last few days, and it looks like it's pretty much neck and neck. At the same time, our market is pricing Brexit at, I think, 30 cents currently, 30% chance that Britain will vote to leave the EU. Do you think the market has it right? And if so, how can it be pricing something that looks like a toss-up so low?
Yeah, it's very surprising. The polls are absolutely close. As far as we can tell, it's 50-50. So it's too difficult to call. And, you know, so that's sort of, you would think that would sort of have a risk or an uncertainty effect on the markets. But we've also are finding we've got about 10% who are undecided. So the question, we don't know what the turnout will be. We know that in a country the size of we have, 45 million people are registered for vote. So that is enormous, whether they will actually come out. But what we have seen is that, as you know, that after having sort of, you know, sort of a downward trend since February, that we've seen a little bit of movement upwards in the last few days. But, you know, sterling was out of favor on international currency markets since February, since the initial deal. But we have seen market volatility, but the last few days it's moved in the other direction. So, you know, is it that people know something that we don't? You know, I would be, you know, I would be less certain about the Remain. I think it's going to be very, very close.
So you're a buyer at 30 cents, in other words, so to speak.
Yes, I'm
Okay.
a little bit more cautious. I'm a little bit more cautious than other people. Having said that, the momentum, I think, has been stalled, and just the last week, I think the momentum of the Leave campaign has been stalled. The other thing, too, is if you take a long view of this, we've had 75 referendums in Europe related to the EU. The majority have come out in favor. So if a track record is anything to go by, you know, most people go for avoidance of risk.
Right, and that must be priced in to some degree by our traders, but I'm sure they'll be interested in hearing your skepticism of that. Well, what would you recommend we all look at between now and the close of polls to give some indication of how this is going? Are there anything you'll be sort of paying particular attention to get a sense of which way the wind is blowing? I understand there's a debate in this evening, British time, so not too far from now. Do you think that's going to change minds, or is that likely opinion is set? Or you said 10% are undecided. You think that could swing, today's event could swing the vote?
Not, a lot of the people who are very much determined to leave have already made their mind up. I don't think there's a lot of, we're going after the undecideds here. We're really going after the people who, the young people, if you want them to remain, if that's where the logic of it is in terms of the economic logic, you want them to show up in droves. And the irony of this is that when this was first proposed, the House of Lords suggested a threshold level, 50%, and said if you don't meet your threshold level of voters, it's invalid. And in some degree, then if these young people and everybody stayed home and didn't participate, they probably wouldn't have met their threshold level. But it's really, the other thing to think about too is that this, if this is a Brexit, it will have a huge shock and uncertainty. And until we know what the terms of trade are between the EU and the UK, it's going to make investment less attractive.
No,
I'm concerned less about what happens in the next 24 hours. I'm concerned what's going to happen in the next, longer term period.
Well, let's talk about that in a moment. I just wanted to pick up, though. I think you're saying then that you'll be looking at turnout on Election Day, and you would associate a high turnout with a favorable condition for the Remain campaign, on the assumption that those would be young people who are turning out in higher than expected numbers.
Absolutely, absolutely. Remember that there were 4 million people voting for UKIP at the last election, and that was only in 2015. The question is, they might be core voters, but I think turnout will be the very, very big issue. Anybody who's predicting it's going to be so close to call that it's too difficult to call right now. All of the, it's a question of, I don't think this debate tonight will really make a difference. And, on the cusp of this is it's risk, it's indecision. There's no exit polls, so we're not going to know. We're going to have to follow the day polls as they come out.
Let's turn then to some of the questions you asked a moment ago. What happens after Election Day? As you know, Predicted is running a market as well on the likelihood that Boris Johnson, who's leading the Leave campaign, will be Prime Minister of the UK by the end of the year. It's trading at 23 cents, which is pretty high for a speculative question like that. Well, why do you think traders are rating Boris's chances so highly? Is he the likely Prime Minister if on short order if Leave wins?
I think there's a question about what happens to David Cameron, Leave or Remain. I mean, his party, parts of his party are unhappy with him right now. And there's been a lot of rumblings from the backbench about whether they'll have a vote of no confidence in him. And so there are some people who are saying, maybe Boris Johnson not by the end of the year, but there are some people who might want to say, well, given the fact that David Cameron, really, really lobbied so hard to remain and didn't remain neutral, we'd like him to give a timetable when he leaves, when he exits, when he's going to step down. So that will be interesting. So one scenario is David gives a date when he's going to step down. The second scenario is he has a challenge, a vote of no confidence. Remember, a ton of conservative leaders have fallen over the issue of Europe and the EU, and there's been votes of no confidence. Ian Duncan Smith had a vote, John Major had a vote of no confidence, Margaret Thatcher, and a lot of it was often about Europe. So Boris Johnson being the potential, he's been the most visible in the campaign, but the question is whether he really conducted himself well in this campaign and whether that was the true Boris Johnson. I'm not so sure it'll be Boris Johnson.
Even if Leave is victorious?
If Leave is victorious, maybe that makes his chances stronger, but there are other people who represent the Leave campaign. You might find a dark horse. You might find Michael Gove has been very, very visible, the Justice Minister. So there are other people as well. There are a number of politicians who came out early. So there are other people besides Boris Johnson that are a possibility.
And you said a minute ago that Cameron could fall even if Remain wins tomorrow, say wins narrowly.
Even if he wins narrowly, that whether he falls or whether he's pushed to say, I will leave, I will step down. He's already said he's not going to run for re-election. But I think some of the people who will be bitter if he wins the campaign will want him to give an exit timetable. And, there are, you need 50 signatures for a vote of no confidence. The question is given the fact that he's got, 130 in his party that want to vote for exit, will they get the 50 signatures? Will they push it? The other option that you turn around and say to yourself, he's just won them an outright electoral victory in May 2015. Will they really want to go to the mat and have, the prospect of having a vote of no confidence and a leadership challenge? They still be the ruling party. The other way out there option is, will he, if he wins, call a snap election? I don't think so, but, he might do that to sort of solidify his position in the party.
Well, that's food for thought. What about the regions? What about Scotland? The SNP has said that in the event of a leave that they will reopen the independence question. Are we looking at a likely second Scottish referendum in the event that Britain votes to leave the EU tomorrow?
I think it's, the question has not been, will we have a second Scottish referendum? Given what happened last time, I think that it's a matter of when they have it. So I would not rule off the table another Scottish referendum. So regardless of the outcome tomorrow. Remember, the other thing that's been very interesting in Scotland is obviously, at the last election, there was a big sweep for the Scottish Nationalist Party. But what we're seeing a little bit of is the revival of the Conservative Party in Scotland. There's been a small-scale revival over the last 12 months, and that's quite interesting because usually, the contest is between Labour and SNP in Scotland. And so the question becomes, yes, there are indications that they would call for that. The other issue is, whether people in Scotland turn out to vote. They might see this as their chance, knowing how critical and key they are for a Remain. If they don't vote, this could push a Brexit, and this could push them to have their second referendum.
You're saying it's possible Leave could win narrowly as a result of abstentions, strategic abstentions on the part of Scots nationalists.
Yes, and some people have raised that issue. I'm, it really just, it depends how strategic people want to be. This is a big decision, I think, for the British, and it feels, this is our second time that we've had a referendum on the EU. And if we go back to 1975, when we'd only been in the EU 2 years, 67% said yes. And it was nowhere near as divisive as this campaign has been. And we also should think about the fact that, this campaign's been going on for, February? It's been going on for many, many months. When we have an election in Britain, we call an election and we have a very short period where, we have an electoral campaign. So this is longer by British standards than is typical, which also, it raises questions. We usually have a very short electoral cycle, campaign period, and this one is much longer, which has obviously had the bigger impact on the markets.
It's a more an American-style campaign, right. And to go back to Scotland and the regions for just 1 second, is there an alternative scenario where England votes to leave but Britain votes to remain on the strength of pro-EU votes in Wales and Scotland, Northern Ireland? And if that should happen, what do British politics look like the day after that?
Yeah, this is, concern people have, that what happens if Wales and Scotland and London, vote to remain, but the rest of sort of Little England, as I like to call myself, votes to leave. The election the referendum is final. The bigger issue, if you think about it from markets, is twofold. If you vote to leave, the legal process then, if the government starts it, it's a twofold legal process. The first part of the process under Article 50 of the treaty will require the British to notify that they want to succeed, to leave. And that is kind of a divorce settlement, if you like, and that takes 2 years. And that will be a 2-year process. The longer it goes, the closer to 2 years, the less advantageous the settlement for Britain. Once we have that in place, the other thing that we're trying to negotiate is a framework for relations with the EU. All of the trade agreements that Britain is part of, we will no longer be part of because we're not in the EU. And most people, the US, China, India, is not going to want to negotiate a trade agreement with Britain until we see the negotiation Britain gets with the EU. Will we have access to the single market? Will we have access to that single market? Under what conditions? And that, to me, is, the post-Brexit settlement is going to be much more significant for foreign direct investment, for what our trade relationship is, than anything else.
Do you see the Obama administration becoming more actively involved, say after a leave vote, in trying to mitigate some of the uncertainty, acting even as a mediator of some kind between Britain and its former EU partners? Is there anything the U.S. can do to minimize at least the short-term economic impact of a leave vote? Or are we bystanders?
We're bystanders. Bystanders for 2 reasons. The first one is that, the British, in terms of its special relationship, if it still has it, its security relationship with the United States, will be less significant outside the EU. There's already been a little bit of a shift and an interest in really close relations with Germany. So that's something for the British to think about in terms of the security angle. The actual economic angle in that respect is that, the U.S. market, or U.S. foreign direct investment, and the trade with the U.K. by U.K. standards from the U.S. is very, very important. In terms of the financial impact, it's, that will be much more significant. But I think in terms of the trade impact, we are, by UK standards, the US is important, but the reverse is not the case. But it will be, perhaps, we will lose our sort of flavor, if you like, because, we're less as a strategic partner within the EU. And we will find, it becomes increasingly difficult. We've already seen sort of corporate investment has been very hesitant over the last few months. It will be, foreign direct investment will look at this and think, what is Britain's post-Brexit relationship with the EU? Will we have access to that market? The concern we have and should have in Britain is that we've become a one-horse economy. We've outperformed other member states of the EU, but we've put all our eggs in terms of the financial services and the service economy in Britain. So it's a very unbalanced economy in the UK.
Well, it looks like we're in for interesting political times, no matter which way the vote goes tomorrow. I know we'll all be looking with great interest as to how Britain votes and in the aftermath. And we'll be following that on Predicted in our markets and in markets that we'll be putting up subsequently. We've come to the end of our webinar. Dr. Egan, I want to thank you very much for your time and for your insights this afternoon. We really appreciate it. Thank you as well to everyone who joined the webinar, who's been listening, and who has sent questions. I hope this has been useful to you. If you have any suggestions, traders, on who you'd like to see or topics you'd like us to cover in future webinars, please send us your feedback again at events@predictit.org. Thanks very much. Thank you, Dr. Egan. I hope
Thank
this is.
you.
Thank you. I hope we'll get a chance to talk again.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.